The free agency frenzy continues. One day, not even a full day, about 12 hours after reports that Kyle Tucker is headed to Los Angeles, which means he was not headed to Toronto or New York, the Mets, one of those runners up for Kyle Tucker, have responded in truly shocking fashion, agreeing to a 3-year, $126 million deal with infielder Bo Bichette. This contract has opt-outs after each of the first 2 years. It is essentially the exact same contract that Alex Bregman received from the Red Sox a year ago, but Bichette is 3 years younger. So you could imagine he had even more incentive to maybe get a shorter term deal, still opt out while he's still in his prime, maybe have a healthier season, more productive on the whole, re-enter the market in one of the next 2 years when the free agency class is projected to be fairly weak. Now, there are some parts of this that it's like, yeah, of course the Mets got Bo Bichette. For one, the team that seemed to be heaviest after Bo was one of their biggest rivals, the Philadelphia Phillies. And if the Mets are going to get back into postseason contention, they are probably going to have to deal with the Philadelphia Phillies at some point in the National League East standings. And you can imagine if they were, contemplating having to deal with Bo Bichette being a part of that Phillies lineup, that would maybe give them a little bit of extra motivation to swoop in and give him this gigantic offer to make sure that he would instead be headed to Queens. The other thing that makes this make sense is the fact that the Mets are still rebuilding their offense. Some by trade, some by free agency. They have let 3 core pieces go this winter, whether it's Brandon Nimmo, whether it's Pete Alonso, whether it's Jeff McNeil. These guys have been mainstays in the Mets lineup for years. Now, they have at least gotten back to maybe where they were. They have traded for Marcus Semien in that same trade that sent Brandon Nimmo to Texas. They signed Jorge Polanco, and now they signed Bo Bichette. Is Bichette, Semien, Polanco a better offensive trio than McNeil, Nimmo, Alonso? I think that's an interesting debate that we're certainly going to be having in the lead up to the season. Everything looks better when you have Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor on your team. Those guys are still the most important parts of this lineup. But Bo Bichette is a beast in the box. He has always been a productive major league hitter. He's been a productive hitter since he was like 12. And now he cashes in with the Mets, at least for the short term, and gets to join a very interesting lineup. So also, you're the Mets. You have the money. You were already getting ready to give Kyle Tucker a truly gargantuan number that only the Dodgers could ultimately beat. And you have to imagine if Steve Cohen, the richest owner in the sport, was comfortable with that, he was going to be comfortable giving Bichette what now looks like a relatively small deal. Their reported last offer to Kyle Tucker being 4 years, 220. They get Bo Bichette for 3 years and 126. Again, could be short term. He could be opting out after the first or second year. But the Mets are trying to get back into being contenders. For all the changes that they've made, acting like the Mets were going to be in some sort of transition period just doesn't feel realistic when you consider their payroll, when you consider how aggressive Steve Cohen has been, when you consider how he's spoken about what he wants the Mets to be, which is obviously contending for a World Series. That was not the case in 2025. They had to bounce back. They had to reimagine the roster, and they have certainly done that. All right, so those are all the reasons why you could say, all right, Bo Bichette, he's a Met, sounds good, good for them, they made it happen. However, there's also a lot with this. It's like, wait, what? What's going on? Why is Bo Bichette on the Mets? Well, first thing, you're wondering, well, where's Bo Bichette going to play? Of course, he's been a shortstop for essentially his entire career. He played some second base in the minors. He played some second base in the World Series as he was coming back from injury. And a lot of people projected Bo to eventually move to second base, maybe even immediately with his next team when you consider how poorly he rated defensively at shortstop. So when we were thinking about fits for Bichette, you were looking at teams that maybe needed a second baseman, not necessarily a shortstop. When the Phillies became a favorite, you looked at their infield with Bryson Stott and Alec Bohm, and you said, oh, okay, well, maybe Bichette would play third base because they want to trade Alec Bohm. Or he could play second, and Bryson Stott, who has experience at third base, could move to third base. Or if he went back to Toronto, he could stay at shortstop where he's always been, or move to second, and Andres Gimenez would move to short. If he went to the Dodgers, they need a second baseman. That would have made a lot of sense. But Bo Bichette, the third baseman, it was honestly not something I saw coming. Um, I thought that this was a player who projected to move, I think, gracefully to second base, a position he has played in the past, a position that I think is a little bit more comfortable for someone who's already used to the middle infield. And Bo Bichette's arm is not awesome, so that's not necessarily something that you expect to translate super well to third base. Range is obviously already an issue for him at short. At third base, maybe that's limited, but I don't know. I always saw him more as a second baseman. Clearly, the Mets are going to play this guy at third base. That is all the indications coming out in the immediate aftermath of this signing breaking, is that he's going to play third, which, all right, let's just grant that Bo Bichette is going to make an awesome transition to third base. Well, that brings a lot of other questions about the rest of this roster, which is what happens with Brett Baty, who the Mets say, we believe in him, we believe in him. He just had a great season, finally healthy, finally played the whole year in the majors, was an above average hitter. You're going to start bouncing him around the outfield, an outfield that is still very, very unsettled outside of Juan Soto. That is not a depth chart that looks awesome right now. Sure, you have a top prospect like Carson Benj coming soon, but that's far from a sure thing. And so this is another move where it's like, what happens next? Why is Bo Bichette at third base plus Jorge Polanco at first base, two positions that neither player has ever played at the major league level, really at any level? How does that fit in with David Stern's stated intentions of prioritizing defense, which, of course, adding someone like Semien certainly seems to fall in line with? But Bichette at third and Polanco at first is like, well, what's going on here? So there are so many questions of what happens next here, especially with Baty, not to mention Mark Vientos, not to mention Ronnie Mauricio, Luis Angel Acuna, and then a wave of prospects that they have coming, at the upper levels. Obviously, when you're a team like the Mets, you got to just get the best players you can right now. I commend them for doing that. But as always in free agency, the most interesting moves are the ones that essentially necessitate more action afterwards. And in this case, I think this is a perfect example of that. And where the Mets go from here, they still haven't really addressed a pitching staff that is in flux as well. How much more aggressive is Steve Cohen going to get? We shouldn't be that surprised that he showed up with the biggest offer here. But this one's truly a stunner, and there's no other way to put it. Bo Bichette is a New York Met, and I'm still processing it.